Today, I want to talk about consciousness. Now, consciousness is a very popular topic these days in spiritual circles. But what really is consciousness, and why is it such a big deal? So, from a very simple perspective, consciousness is that which makes us conscious, right? It's very simply the knowing. So I'm conscious now because I am knowing. I'm knowing the beingness of this being. So this being knows. So consciousness, in a very simple way of describing it, could be described as awareness or the knowing. Now, in Buddhism, this is a big topic, awareness. You hear this a lot. So awareness is considered something that exists in nature, in a sense, like an element in nature. If you hear someone like a very esteemed teacher called Ajahn Sumedho, and he says, in addition to the 5 elements in nature, which is earth, water, fire, etc., etc., consciousness is an element that comes into it, right? So consciousness, or this awareness, is an element that exists in the sphere of natural elements. So where there's consciousness, there's awareness, and where there's awareness, there's life. So there's 2 kinds of ways that consciousness is referred to in Buddhism. One is in the conditional sense. So consciousness happens in conjunction with sense awareness to bring about an experience. So, for example, the organ of the eye sees an object. So the sight sees an object. That sight, the ability to see, comes into conjunction with consciousness or eye consciousness, and then you see something. So that's how it's described in Buddhism. So in that sense, it's a conditioned element. In another sense, if we think about it, consciousness is something that exists almost unconditionally, so when all the conditions are taken away, the only thing that remains is consciousness. So in one sense, it's referred to as the unconditioned in Buddhism. This is a label that we put on something, but we're saying it's something that exists without condition. So the consciousness that I have, right, without all my conditioning, all my psychology, all my habits, is the same as the conditioning that you have, which is the same as the conditioning that a fish has. So the fish might not have the vocal ability, but it's conscious. And it's also the same as the consciousness that a plant has. So it's a simpler form of life, maybe simpler in one sense. We can't take light and produce food, right? We need to eat. Plants can do that. So who's to say, or great trees can do that. Who's to say that we're the superior beings or the more developed beings just because we can talk and think? So that same element of consciousness resides in a plant as well. So if you take a plant and you change its direction, it has this sense of consciousness to grow towards the light. So this element of consciousness, or this element of being aware of life itself, is something quite mystical and awe-inspiring. And when we sit in meditation, the way I see it, is we're taking time to actually, apart from everything else that we do with meditation, is to actually come and become aware of the consciousness. So it's awareness becoming aware of itself, if that makes sense. So when you sit in meditation, that's what you're doing. You're coming into contact with that direct life force energy that runs through everything, that creates life. If you look at a human body, which is alive, it's the only difference between a body. If you ever watch somebody die, gradually the consciousness starts to fade, and then there's a point where the consciousness is gone, and then even though at a physical level your body might be the same as their body, there's a huge difference because of consciousness. So in a sense, I talked about rebirth in the previous talk. You could ask what gets reborn, and it's this consciousness. This consciousness is moving to different forms, and it stays in a form for a while, and there's life, and then it moves into another form, and there's life maybe somewhere else. In the Buddhist sense, the Buddha compares, when someone asks him what happens to an arahant after death, he says, what happens to a fire if it goes out in one place and then it arises in the other? Is it the same fire? So in a sense, we're all, consciousness is, there's a very nice image that comes to mind from Ram Dass, where this is an image that I saw, and it's like consciousness is like this puppet master that is putting its hands through different puppets, right? So it's the same consciousness which is acting through you, which is acting through me, which is acting through the birds outside, which is acting through the plants and the greenery, and everything is a play of consciousness. And what more can we say about consciousness? And another thing, of course, is in the Buddhist chants, there's a chant about the unconditioned, right? And they say, if there were, everything has come, everything that we know which is conditioned is dualistically one side, and if this conditioned realm exists, then there must be something that is unconditioned, right? So Ajahn Sumedho, the teacher that I'm talking about, that talks a lot about consciousness, he says form exists in consciousness. It's not consciousness existing in form, right? So this element of consciousness, which is sort of an eternal element, and within this eternal element, within this consciousness and space element, forms are arising, forms are ceasing, and it's all like the analogy I gave about Ram Dass, where Ram Dass talks about consciousness playing, like there's a word in Sanskrit called lila, which means play. So everything is a play of consciousness. And coming into contact with this quality as often as you can is wonderful. So another way that we can contact it, and this is another teaching from Ajahn Sumedho, is if you go into a very silent place. So the whole idea of sort of, having this constant awareness is to be constantly aware of this consciousness awareness, play of words. But he talks about becoming really silent, and you hear this sort of electrical buzzing sound. The first time I went to a monastery, I'd never been in an environment that was so quiet. And as I sat down, as I settled in, I started to hear this kind of high-pitched buzz, almost like a tinnitus. And Ajahn Sumedho basically says that this is something called the sound of silence. He calls it the sound of silence. The Sanskrit term for it is nada. So if you can become aware of this quality just on a daily basis, as you're sitting, as you're in a stressful situation, and you hear this sort of buzzing, I'm not talking about tinnitus here, I'm talking about this sort of sound of silence. If you can start to tune into it, then you can sort of pull away from all the conditioned chaos of the world, and you can come to this place where consciousness is abiding, right? Untouched by anything in the conditioned world. So you might even call it like residing in this kind of divine state. And that's a short talk on consciousness. Please take what you find useful and discard what you don't.